We're in part 14 now of the central nervous system, the brain, and we're dealing with special functions of the brain. And at this moment, we're slipping over here into language. Okay, and there are two main language areas. There's one called Broca's area and one called Wernicke's area. They are sort of, how shall I say, organized areas of Brodmann's areas. So patients, it says, with lesions involving Broca's area can understand language but have difficulty speaking because Broca's is in the frontal lobe where we have, how shall I say, muscular skills. So the speaking of the language for these individuals is difficult because the motor skills have been disrupted. Wernicke's area is in a different part of the brain that involves, how shall I say, again, overlays in the temporal area of the brain. Let's take a look over here. And that involves the, we don't have it there. We have to go back this way. Okay, so this is back where we were looking at the original Broca's areas. Do you remember that? We were over here looking at the exterior of the brain this way, like this. Okay, and you can see over here in the frontal lobe we have the Broca's area, and that's described right here and pointed to in this region. Okay, and these are motor regions that have to do with the articulation, the skills of their articulation. These are more or less the same in everyone. There are some differences between male and female. I want to bring that up. Broca is right there. Wernicke's area is here, and this is a language area in which we learn to understand language. So there is the complex sorting out of vocabulary and then grammar, syntax, and all of that business, where the complexity of language, understanding language, exists. People who have injury here do not understand language, but they speak. And they speak the way a small child speaks. They might repeat sounds, or they might just utilize their previous skills at language and spout what is referred to as word salad. That is to say, they can articulate words, and so they do. Whereas people with lesions here cannot speak at all, or are interrupted in their speech in some way or another. And so there is some impairment, whereas understanding is clear. Okay, sometimes going from language to language, if you've left your language for a while and gone to live somewhere else, it's hard to come back in the first days. You understand what's being said, but then to initiate and articulate, that's not an injury to the Broca's area. It's just a lack of association with those words and thinking in that language and syntax and grammar. So sometimes people can have a hard time shifting between languages. Sometimes languages afford us the possibility to say something that we couldn't otherwise say in a different language, right? So I have friends who say things in Spanish more readily and easily than they can possibly say in English. And by the same token, it's possible to be legalistic in the English language in ways that are not at all possible in other languages, the Romance languages in particular, the Spanish, Italian, and so on. So each language has its own, in some ways, skill set with regard to syntax and grammar. One of the things that we need to note, though, is that Brodmann in the early 1900s, very early, like 1904, 1905, 1906, was identifying areas in the brains of Northern European white males, right-handed. And those individuals were unusually lateralized individuals, and it came to be known later that their female cohort were much more global in the display of language, because it turns out that language has a neurotransmitter, which is one of the estrogen molecules, part of the family of estrogen, estradiol, estrone, etc. So as a result of that, males have to change their testosterone into estrogen. Females already have a significant concentration in their bloodstream to begin with, so they're able to almost bathe a little bit in language itself. And some people, in fact, use language in that sort of comforting sort of way, and often wish to speak in various settings in order to get comfortable with an idea or with a group of people. Okay, so at any rate, on average, too, females get to speak language more somewhat earlier than males on average. Sometimes there's an ability to, on average, come into linguistic skills, learning to read and write and so on, a little bit earlier. So the deal here is that some individuals retain a more global, less lateralized orientation toward language, and that's something to be noted. Some people also, because of the nature of language, are not able to, or at least they report not being able to internally visualize the life things around them. When they think about things, they think about them verbally, and other people think about things sometimes visually. Okay, so there are differences. It was something that was quite notable, at least in my medical school setting, where there were individuals who were almost completely uninterested in anatomy, and they were interested to some extent, but they more or less looked at books and literature to understand anatomy, whereas some of the rest of us were actually engaged in dissection work in the 3D experience of anatomy. And I had one classmate who used to guide one of my friends and I in our dissection work, and she would stand on a stool above us with the textbook in her hand, reading to us where we were going. And oftentimes we would find exactly what she was describing, and we would shine a light into the cadaver area that we were working on to show and demonstrate to her what we had found. And she would barely glance at it, and she would go, "Uh-huh," and then she would go on to the next thing which we were to find. And somehow the visual experience for her was just not happening. At any rate, I offer you those ideas regarding language, and we have to now go on to the next thing, which is memory. So that was language. A few more details, actually. I'll just finish up this section right here with this aspect right here. We're actually looking at page 456, and we're right below figure 20 or 1220, and they're talking about here the relationship of Broca's and Wernicke's area, that together with the basal nuclei form a single language implementation system. So that is to say, in order to speak clearly and enunciate properly and to utilize the sounds of a particular language, basal nuclei are important in this. You previously indicated that fine motor movement is involved, that is to say, modified and maintained by the basal nuclei. So they don't initiate anything, but they do modify what you're doing so that you can draw well and write well. And this would, of course, also extend to speech. So the things that you develop and your skills through the basal nuclei, you can imagine that language has its fine motor movement, both in the tongue, lips, facial expression. There's a lot of ways of conveying information. They talk here about body language. And so basal nuclei are playing a role. Oftentimes it's a role that includes value judgment, right? So one expresses one sense of approval or disapproval or good or bad or something like this as an aspect of language. Okay, so that completes our project on language, and we'll pick up memory.